Whether it's people thirsting over Victorian Gothic vampires or the most popular Halloween costumes, it's hard to understate just how popular the horror genre is. Some of the most well-known authors ever focused on horror, from Edgar Allan Poe to H.P. Lovecraft, Mary Shelley, and even more contemporary authors like Stephen King. Naturally, a lot of people want to take a crack at it themselves, which I'm sure is what brought you here. But writing horror isn't as straightforward as something like fantasy or sci-fi. So here's an unlucky 13 horror writing tips to carry you from the planning stages all the way through the bloody execution. I'll be using both literary and cinematic examples because storytelling transcends medium, and because most people are likely more familiar with movies. Also, a lot of these are pulled from different sources. Art is a subjective and collaborative thing, so this advice comes from my own experience and the experience of the rest of the writing community. Without further ado, let's get spooky. Obviously, one of the first things that come to mind for writing horror is the scares. And I'm sure you've read or watched something, sat back and said, that wasn't scary at all. So how do you scare someone? Well, when it comes to fear, too many people look to external sources rather than internal. In other words, what scares you? Because whatever it is, I promise you're not alone. Writing from a place of your own fears allows you to tap directly into the rationale of why something is so scary, the phases you go through as your anxiety climbs just thinking about it. For example, if I'm not scared of spiders, it's going to be harder for me to pull out what exactly makes them scary, as opposed to someone with crippling arachnophobia conjuring details like unnatural writhing legs or numerous pitch black eyes plastered across its face. And this goes for anything. Do you fear the ocean depths like Lovecraft? Does the idea of vengeful ghosts make your heart palpitate? Whatever you choose, you should keep tip number 2 in mind. What's scarier? An unstoppable, unkillable, emotionless force that you are powerless against, or a very mortal and unhinged individual? Mileage will vary depending on who you ask, but despite the latter example being objectively less powerful, its fear factor comes from the fact that it not only could be very real, but sometimes is. With all the true crime documentaries detailing just how twisted the human mind can be, grounded horror cannot be overstated. Even the craziest cosmic horror monsters are grounded in fanatic cults and terrifying rituals, very real things that we coexist with on this earth. Scream, for example, has a killer that is frequently knocked away or repelled because under the mask is just a normal person. And the fact that they simply look like anyone you could pass on the street conjures a truly unsettling feeling. When delving into the unfamiliar, your readers or viewers need to latch on to something familiar. Most people haven't had to fight for their lives against a serial killer. However, plenty have had friends that were just a little too comfortable with dark humor.
It takes a man to do something like that.
Yo, I'm gonna gut your ass in a second, kid.
Tell me something.
Did you really put her liver in the mailbox? Because I heard that they found her liver in the mailbox next to her spleen and her pancreas.
And this kind of familiarity is what feeds into tip number 3. I remember when Five Nights at Freddy's came out, I was genuinely unsettled by the character's appearance, despite never having played the game. However, the more I was exposed, the less scary it became, until it was like, oh yeah, there's that bear again. The scary appearance only gets you so far, which is why it helps for your monster to mean something. You'll eventually be desensitized to a terrifying appearance, but the dark places people can spiral to, represented by monsters like the Babadook, for example, will always prove a disturbing thought. The same goes for Ghostface from Scream, the fear that these horror movies can inspire more killers. The ethical questions posed by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein continue to plague our minds, even when that monster has been played for laughs numerous times. An iconic scary appearance will work for a bit, but to craft a creature with long-lasting terror, have its design and aspects be informed by the deeper, darker themes it represents. While your monster should represent some kind of primal fear, human condition, or what have you, don't go about touting all your reasoning. After all, tip number 4 reminds us that the unknown is often scarier than the known. This even extends to a very literal sense, like in Jaws. We all know that sharks are basically footballs with teeth, but if they were inherently scary, then movies like Three-Headed Shark Attack would be the peak of horror cinema. But Jaws is so effective due in large part to Bruce barely appearing in the movie. We know what a shark looks like, but this is a big monster shark, extra dangerous. So our brains automatically make it 10 times scarier. Although, to be fair, another big reason that Jaws works so well is that it blurs the line of horror and thriller. Which brings us to horror writing tip number 5. In genres like romance or western, you can stick to a lovey-dovey plot or sheriffs and bandits and still produce something phenomenal. Horror, though, is usually at its best when it's paired with other genres, and you can get really wild with this. While horror is usually paired with genres like slasher, thriller, and supernatural, you shouldn't feel restricted. You've got romance horror like Warm Bodies, or one of my personal favorite mixes, comedy horror like Zombieland. If you find your writing getting a bit melodramatic, try playing horror completely straight, try changing it up. After all, if your readers are laughing, it lowers their guard, making it easier for you to slot in some seriously intense scares, so try mixing it up. Although, I say that with an asterisk, because some genres have been mixed with horror so much, they have an entire subgenre's worth of tired cliches and tropes. So, maybe you're sitting there and you think, well, if horror is so watered down with tropes and cliches, I'll do a satire of the horror genre. But you're gonna have to get in line behind the entire Scream franchise, Cabin in the Woods, New Nightmare, every scary movie film, and probably 1,000 more I've never heard of. It simply isn't enough to just turn horror tropes on their head. In order to stand out, you'll need to get really creative or really specific. Instead of trying to lampoon the entire genre, try for a subgenre, like how Scream or Tucker and Dale vs. Evil focused on slasher horror films. Or you could focus on a particular movie or franchise, like how modern technology might render plot points in older stories moot, or how certain iconic scenes make no sense viewed from a different lens. I always hated the sentiment of every story has already been told because there's always new ways to tell stories. But in some cases, like horror satire, it can take a lot more work to stand out. Jumping from the pre-planning stages of storytelling, we get into the writing tips for the actual structure of the story. And one of the most important aspects is giving a sense of impending doom. If you want to write something truly terrifying, the scares start long before the killer in a spooky mask pops out. Even in the happy prologue, your characters might notice an oddly gnarled tree in the daytime, only for it to be turned into a twisted, possessed entity later on. As the big man of horror, Alfred Hitchcock, once said, "There is no terror in the bang, only the anticipation of it." The drawn-out moments of the audience holding their breath is what ratchets up the terror. And the best stories draw attention to several sharp details with an ominous presence, building the belief that these characters are quite literally headed straight for their doom around every corner, and they're in control of nothing. If Chucky, Annabelle, The Exorcist, and The Shining have shown us anything, it's that children and their belongings are terrifying. Except they actually aren't. What's really scary is that these joyous, wholesome things are distorted. We're used to things being such a certain way that warning lights fire off in our heads the instant we notice anything wrong. Jordan Peele's Get Out presents a seemingly average, if backwards, American suburb, but things feel the slightest bit off, which sets every fiber of our being into defense mode. And I'm not just talking about the racism, because these townsfolk have even more sinister plans for our main character. A similar thing is done in H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth. Even if Lovecraft does things for the complete opposite reason. The narrator describes the inhospitable port town of Innsmouth, including the certain Innsmouth look the residents have. Maybe they just don't care for outsiders. Or maybe there's something much more evil beneath. They both take a residential setting, places where we regularly spend time and live out daily activities, and they heighten certain aspects until it's just barely noticeably off-kilter, enough for us to know that things are much worse than we initially think. In other words, take the familiar and twist it in a way that just feels a little wrong. While you're twisting and distorting reality though, don't forget the basics and give us good, well-rounded characters. Unfortunately, a lot of horror stories forget this step. When stock character number 3 bites the dust, generally the only thing discussed is how they died. However, when fan favorite, wisecracking comedic relief is even in a dangerous situation, everyone is on the edge of their seat. It's because we've grown to love and care about their character. Steven Spielberg's Poltergeist spends a long time learning about the characters, their jobs, and their family dynamics before the scares even start, wanting to see them safe and to escape the vengeful spirits carry us through the whole movie. This is a really basic tip, but remember that you're not writing cannon fodder, you're writing fully developed people, which brings me to tip number 10. Just don't do it. If someone was running from a serial killer 5 minutes before, they're not going to investigate a strange noise alone and unequipped. There's a whole subculture devoted to shouting out the dumb decisions horror characters make, and it pulls audiences out of that fear zone because it breaks the suspension of belief. When you go to write an action, ask yourself if this character is acting out of rationale, or if they're doing it simply because the plot demands it. This point also runs the risk of purveying stereotypes. If you're writing an airheaded blonde cheerleader, you're already walking a thin line, and killing her off because of a stupid mistake won't help your case. Smart characters getting outsmarted and realistic reactions to horrifying situations will hold more weight than things happening just because you want them to happen. It'll make the story more rewarding for both you and your audience. And speaking of rewarding your readers, if you're writing a slasher horror, yeah, it'll probably be a bit of a gore fest. That being said though, gore isn't scary. If you go to read any amateur creepypasta online, you'll see plenty of blood and guts all over the place without feeling the slightest bit of fear. And I think it's because a lot of horror treats gore as the scare factor when it should be treated as the consequence of the scare. You need all the previous points, like characters we care about, impending doom, and an intimidating monster. Gore for gore's sake just isn't going to get you the mileage you might hope for. And you don't even necessarily need gore. Plenty of novels and movies have horror without a single drop of blood, and they still manage to terrify audiences. Never underestimate what a good atmosphere can do. Speaking of which, whether it's a dilapidated mansion, a too picturesque suburbia, a dark field far away from civilization, or the twisted trees of a pitch-black forest, the atmosphere can make or break work. Your setting can be anything, but the way it's presented, that's what makes this tip unique to horror writing. This is where you can really distort reality. Instead of a smiling neighbor, perhaps they wear a plastic grin that spreads a bit too wide on their cheeks. Maybe the trees cast twisted shadows that claw at our heroes. And the atmosphere can go hand in hand with the monster. Are they a stark contrast to the setting and atmosphere? Are they a product of it? Atmosphere is where you really settle your readers in for a spooky experience. While writing atmosphere is a more technical aspect, an even more technical aspect is sentence length. I know, this sounds like I was running out of horror writing tips, but it's actually really important. A character trapped in a claustrophobic space, tight breathing, imminent danger, heavy footfalls nearby. He's getting closer. His axe scrapes across the floor. Short, snappier sentences read faster. They feel more urgent. A character facing immediate danger is not the place for long, flowery sentences. Your writing should absolutely reflect the tone of your scenes, which means playing with sentence length and cadence. And yeah, mix all this advice together in a cauldron and you'll be on your way to crafting a truly terrifying horror story. Of course, tips, tools, and advice are just that. Helpful guides, not hard, fast rules. If you want to write a terror tale that ignores every point that I made in this video, there's nothing blocking your way. Except the scariest horror villain of all time. The writer's block. They say he lurks within every blank page, creeping between college-ruled notebooks and Microsoft Word document files. He feeds off of writers, sucking their ideas out until they're left a creative husk of a human, grasping at straws. Oh, there are ways to fight the block, but it only staves him off. His hunt is relentless. It's only a matter of time before he returns, with the sound of crumbling pages and keyboards untapped. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, just try and write.
Thank you you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening into today's broadcast. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell to never miss another one of our fancy newfangled moving pictures. Tune in next week to catch another thrilling installment with A.U. Thor.